again, then it would be worth it, and sod the critics.
When people talk about the Beatles, the conversation often revolves around masterpieces, the albums and songs that changed the direction of popular music forever. But for John Lennon, not every Beatles track was worthy of praise. Buried within the band's massive catalog are songs that Lennon dismissed, songs he would later look back on with contempt. And among those, one track stood out as the one he despised more than any other. Dig It, the rambling, half-finished jam that found its way onto the Let It Be album. For Lennon, Dig It represented everything that went wrong during the Beatles' final years. It was directionless, sloppy, and a far cry from the carefully crafted pop perfection that had made them legends. The song wasn't even a real song in the traditional sense, just a loose studio jam stitched together into a short fragment. Yet somehow, it survived the sessions and ended up on the album that was meant to mark their last statement as a band. To Lennon, it was a humiliating inclusion. He saw it as proof of how low the group had fallen, and he never stopped hating it. The Let It Be project was supposed to bring the Beatles back to basics. 4 men in a room, playing live with no tricks, no overdubs, no grand studio experiments. But the reality was far different. By January 1969, the band was fractured beyond repair. Lennon was addicted to heroin. McCartney was increasingly domineering. George Harrison felt ignored and unappreciated. And Ringo Starr seemed caught in the middle, weary of the constant tension. Every day in the studio became a battlefield, filled with passive aggression, cutting remarks, and the growing realization that the magic was gone. It was in this environment that Dig It came to life, or rather, stumbled into existence. The band launched into a free-form jam, tossing out half-baked lines and chord progressions with no real destination. To Lennon, it wasn't creativity, it was chaos. Instead of working on songs with structure and meaning, they were wasting time on nonsense. For a man who prided himself on sharp lyrics and powerful ideas, this sort of aimless filler was an embarrassment. The irony was that Dig It wasn't even meant to be taken seriously. McCartney, always one to push for productivity, seemed willing to entertain it as part of the warts and all philosophy behind the Get Back project. Producer Phil Spector later cut it down to under a minute, leaving just a bizarre fragment on the final album. But Lennon saw even that as an insult. The Beatles, the greatest band in the world, ending their career with scraps and filler? To him, it was unforgivable. For Lennon, songs like Dig It highlighted just how far the group had drifted from their prime. In 1965 and 1966, they had been unstoppable, producing groundbreaking albums like Rubber Soul and Revolver. Every track felt purposeful, every lyric deliberate. But by 1969, the band was wasting tape on jams that sounded more like barroom fooling around than history-making music. Lennon's contempt for Dig It wasn't just about the track itself. It was about what it symbolized. A band at war with itself, trapped in the studio, unable to recapture its old fire. This loathing was amplified by the way Let It Be was released. Lennon was already bitter about the project. He had grown tired of McCartney's attempts to steer the sessions, and he felt that his own contributions were being dismissed or watered down. He resented the idea that Phil Spector, a producer he had mixed feelings about, had been brought in to salvage the tapes. When Lennon listened to the final product with Dig It still sitting there like a joke gone wrong, it only deepened his hatred for the entire record. Dig It also contrasted sharply with Lennon's own ambitions at the time. He wanted the Beatles to make bold, uncompromising statements. He'd written songs that confronted politics, love, addiction, and disillusionment. But instead of showcasing that kind of intensity, the band's final album included a meaningless jam. To Lennon, it was beneath them. It wasn't art. It wasn't revolutionary. It was nothing. There's another layer to Lennon's disdain for Dig It, his pride as a songwriter. Lennon always took great pride in crafting lyrics that cut deep, whether they were brutally honest or abstract and surreal. Even when he tossed off a so-called throwaway, it usually had some wit or bite. But Dig It lacked all of that. It had no melody, no cleverness, no structure. It was just noise. For a man obsessed with being seen as a serious artist, this was humiliating. The tragedy is that Dig It wasn't an isolated moment. It reflected the disintegration of the Beatles as a unit. They weren't pushing each other anymore. They weren't collaborating with the same energy. Instead of lifting one another up, they were dragging each other down. McCartney's perfectionism clashed with Lennon's cynicism. Harrison's creativity was stifled, and Ringo quietly tried to keep the peace. Songs like Dig It emerged because the band no longer had the will or unity to shape their ideas into something lasting. Fans have debated for years whether Dig It should have even been on the album. Some argue it captures the raw, unpolished side of the Beatles, showing them as real musicians messing around in the studio. Others see it as proof that the band had lost focus. Lennon, however, never entertained the romanticized view. For him, Dig It wasn't charming or playful. It was garbage, and he resented the fact that the world would forever associate it with the Beatles' final chapter. Over time, Lennon's hatred of the track only grew. Whenever he discussed the Let It Be sessions, his tone was dismissive and bitter. He described the process as joyless, dominated by arguments and frustration. And Dig It was the embodiment of that misery, a fragment of nonsense that somehow survived when so many better moments were left behind. It became a symbol of failure, a reminder of everything the Beatles could have been, but weren't by the end. The most painful irony for Lennon may have been how fans perceived Dig It. Some listeners, especially younger ones, took it as a quirky experiment, a little inside joke from the band. They laughed at its absurdity, treating it as a fun curiosity. But Lennon wasn't laughing. He saw it as a stain on the group's reputation, an unnecessary blemish on the body of work he otherwise viewed with pride. He could never forgive it for existing, and he could never forgive himself for letting it slip through. In the broader story of the Beatles, Dig It is just a footnote, less than a minute of tape on an album filled with more important songs. But for John Lennon, it was much more than that. It was the track that summed up the collapse of the band, the loss of their focus, and the waste of their potential. It was the song he hated above all others because it forced him to confront what the Beatles had become.